Russian submarines and spy ships are aggressively operating near the vital undersea cables that carry almost all global internet communications, raising concerns among some U.S. military and intelligence officials that the Russians might be planning to attack those lines in times of tension or conflict. The issue goes beyond old worries during the Cold War that the Russians would tap into the cables, a task U.S. intelligence agencies also mastered decades ago. The alarm today is deeper. The ultimate Russian hack on the United States could involve severing the fiber optic cables at some of their hardest-to-access locations to halt the instant communications on which the West's governments, economies, and citizens have grown dependent. While there is no evidence yet of any cable cutting, the concern is part of a growing wariness among senior U.S. and allied military and intelligence officials over the accelerated activity by Russian armed forces around the globe. At the same time, the internal debate in Washington illustrates how the United States is increasingly viewing every Russian move through a lens of deep distrust, reminiscent of relations during the Cold War. Inside the Pentagon and the nation's spy agencies, the assessments of Russia's growing naval activities are highly classified and not publicly discussed in detail. U.S. officials are secretive about what they are doing both to monitor the activity and to find ways to recover quickly if cables are cut. But more than a dozen officials confirmed in broad terms that it had become the source of significant attention in the Pentagon. "I'm worried every day about what the Russians may be doing," said Rear Admiral Frederick J. Roeg, commander of the Navy's submarine fleet in the Pacific, who would not answer questions about possible Russian plans for cutting the undersea cables. Commander William Marks, a Navy spokesman in Washington, said, "It would be a concern to hear any country was tampering with communication cables. However, due to the classified nature of submarine operations, we do not discuss specifics." In private, however, commanders and intelligence officials are far more direct. They report that from the North Sea to Northeast Asia and even in waters closer to U.S. shores, they are monitoring significantly increased Russian activity along the known routes of the cables, which carry the lifeblood of global electronic communications and commerce. Just last month, the Russian spy ship Yantar, equipped with two self-propelled deep-sea submersible craft, cruised slowly off the east coast of the United States on its way to Cuba, where one major cable lands near the U.S. naval station at Guantanamo Bay. It was monitored constantly by U.S. spy satellites, ships, and planes. Navy officials said the Yantar and the submersible vehicles it can drop off its decks have the capability to cut cables miles down in the sea. "The level of activity," a senior European diplomat said, "is comparable to what we saw in the Cold War." One NATO ally, Norway, is so concerned that it has asked its neighbors for aid in tracking Russian submarines. Admiral James Stavridis, formerly NATO's top military commander and now dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, said in an email last week that this is yet another example of a highly assertive and aggressive regime seemingly reaching backwards for the tools of the Cold War, albeit with a high degree of technical improvement. The operations are consistent with Russia's expanding military operations into places like Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and Syria, where President Vladimir Putin has sought to demonstrate a much longer reach for Russian ground, air, and naval forces. The risk here is that any country could cause damage to the system and do it in a way that is completely covered, without having a warship with a cable-cutting equipment right in the area, said Michael Sechrist, a former project manager for a Harvard-MIT research project funded in part by the Defense Department. Cables get cut all the time, by anchors that are dragged, by natural disasters, said Sechrist, who published a 2012 study of the vulnerabilities of the undersea cable network. But most of those cuts take place within a few miles from shore, and can be repaired in a matter of days. What worries Pentagon planners most is that the Russians appear to be looking for vulnerabilities at much greater depths, where the cables are hard to monitor and breaks are hard to find and repair. Sechrist noted that the locations of the cables are hardly secret. Undersea cables tend to follow the similar path since they were laid in the 1860s, he said, because the operators of the cables want to put them in familiar environments under long-standing agreements. The exception are special cables, with secret locations, that have been commissioned by the United States for military operations. They do not show up on widely available maps, and it is possible the Russians are hunting for those, officials said. The role of the cables is more important than ever before. They carry more than $10 trillion a day in global business,